Drink and be merry, my lovely little peppercorns, for I am Noa Lee, god of game criticism and lord of excellent taste, wishing you a happy new year as we reflect upon 2024 with a recap of all the games that made it special, as well as a few that didn't. Much like last year, I'm going to take it month by month and touch briefly upon each game I feel is worth discussing while giving a quick little critique for each. And anytime you see something like this pop up in the corner, that means I've done a full video of the game in question and have linked to it in the description below, as well as in a playlist of everything I did last year at the end of this video. New Year's binge watches are very much encouraged, as YouTube seems to hate me for some reason. Can't imagine why. Anyway, unlike last year, I'm also going to sidebar a bit when I feel it's warranted to talk about some of the trends and fads I noticed and the games that are representative of them, and as an added bonus, I'll also be slowly revealing my personal top 10 games of the year in whatever order we happen upon them. So don thy comfy clothes, grab thy favorite warm and soothing libation, and get cozy as we toast to the new year and reflect upon the old. For me, 2024's gaming season didn't really begin until the release of Momodora Moonlit Farewell, as it was the first new release of the year that I played, and what a game to kick things off with, as it's not only one of the finest games of the year, but one that I'm honored to call my first critique since retiring my old YouTube channel and starting this new one. It also manages to take the number 9 spot in my list of the best games of the year. Momodora Moonlit Farewell is the 5th and perhaps final installment of the long-running and underappreciated Momodora series, and probably its best game, though I'm quite fond of Momo 2 and Reverie Under the Moonlight as well. Combining some of the best high-bit pixel art I've ever seen with tight controls, excellent level design, and animation and music that is truly breathtaking, as well as a story and characters that melt my icy heart, Moonlit Farewell isn't just another Metroidvania, but a raising of the bar for the entire genre, and the perfect game to kick off one of 2024's biggest trends. 2024 saw the release of many, and I do mean many, new Metroidvanias, most of which were merely solid takes on well-worn tropes and mechanics that don't really bring anything new to the table, but a surprising number of them managed to innovate within this genre that in recent years has become very oversaturated. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown leaned heavily into its delightful combat and movement systems with their accompanying tight controls and action-packed tempo, while also delivering one of the grandest entries in the entire genre with a scope that can only really be accomplished with the resources of a AAA studio, proving without a shadow of a doubt that there remains some real talent in the blackened heart of Ubisoft, and its name is Montpellier. Tales of Kenzera Zao would have been an interesting combat-focused Metroidvania had it not the unfortunate luck to be released a few months after The Lost Crown, which essentially explored all of these same ideas, had a similar aesthetic, and a much better combat system, causing this poor title to come across as little more than a cheap knockoff of a much better game, which is a shame, as it's a decent little gem that managed to capture a solid fan base, but in the shadow of one of the year's finest, it just can't compete. Though Path of the Teal Lotus wowed with its beautiful Okami-inspired visuals, though it seems to have been a bit of a letdown to many as it focused more on platforming than on exploration and combat, but to the more refined palette, such as my own, that's only a point in the game's favor as a unique take on the genre. Turbo Kid was a bizarre but endearing mix of a Metroidvania and a BMX game, Mini-Shoot Adventures a cutesy top-down bullet hell action-adventure, and Biomorph was a game about taking on the form of your recently killed foes to use their abilities to progress and solve puzzles, while Nerea, The Gold Project, Biogun, Pompous and Celine, Moonlight Pulse, Rebel Transmute, Mobius Machine, and Gestalt Steam and Cinder all formed the backbone of solid but quotidian takes on the genre that are all worth a playthrough in their own right, but fall far short of noteworthiness. In contrast, Ultros was a trippy, oversaturated psychedelic take on the genre that unabashedly places its visual pomp over almost everything else. A decent enough game, but a feast for the eye more so than for the hand, as was Voidrot, which delights with its Lovecraftian hand-drawn visuals, but ultimately falls flat as yet another Hollow Knight wannabe. And on that note, Hollow Knight's Silk Song is still nowhere to be found. Maybe next year. And of course, there were the 2 best Metroidvanias to release this past year that we'll absolutely be talking about in greater depth later in the video. There's something to be said about a game that manages to enthrall despite having very little interaction, and in which the vast majority of your time spent with it will be reading. However, Home Safety Hotline is no visual novel, is no text-based adventure, but instead a call center simulator of sorts where you play as one of the unfortunate souls tasked with answering the calls and guiding each caller through whatever predicament they happen to find themselves in by sending them the necessary and hopefully accurate information based on the description of their problem. This encyclopedia of oddities really paints a picture of what this world is really like, and I'm beyond impressed with how expertly developer Night Signal Entertainment managed to build its world with such concise entries for each of its problems the denizens of this world might find themselves having a run-in with. Careful reading, memorization, and a knack for listening and deciphering the cries of your kooky callers are your only assets if you hope to save these poor souls from the disturbing anomalies of Bogarts, Pukas, bed teeth, and face shenanigans that have infected their home. A glorious little game that's unlike anything else I've ever played, and one that's all the richer with the equally endearing Seasonal Worker DLC. It doesn't quite make my top 10, but it gets a personal recommendation from me for sure. Graven, despite being a decent little throwback to the Heretic/Hexen games, was one that probably could have used another year in the oven, as upon its release, the game was rife with bugs and glitches that range from the minor and annoying to the game-breaking and disastrous. Softlocks after beating bosses, ammo not dropping when defeating enemies or dropping only for one of your dozen or so weapons, crashes and slapdash updates by the developers which deleted more than a few players' save files, bricked their game, or cranked up the difficulty in some areas that didn't need it while decreasing it in areas that actually could have used a bit of a buff. And that's a real shame, because when Graven is functioning as intended, it's a hell of a lot of fun and quite the interesting little gem that I enjoyed immensely as a unique take on the genre that lands somewhere between the classic FPS and the immersive sim. That said, even if the game was free from bugs and the developers were a bit more competent with how they rolled out updates and interacted with their community, Graven would still be a bit of a mess due to its overall inconsistent quality. Some areas like the peat swamps of Chapter 1 are well designed and interesting, as is the first half of Chapter 2's Snowy Caves, Ruins, and Mansion, but right around the halfway point there's a noticeable drop-off in level design and enemy and trap positioning that feels as though the developers just half-assed it all as they limp to the finish. And I can't really recommend the game even now, almost a year later, as it's still a broken, buggy mess, and the developers appear to have abandoned the game entirely in this unfinished state since going radio silent after the most recent update, which was in April. This wouldn't be such a huge issue if it weren't for the fact that Chapter 1, the part that was in early access for years, is solid enough that the game seems perfectly fine and doesn't reveal itself as unfinished and glitchy as hell until well past the 2-hour return window on Steam. Clearly, Slipgate Ironworks is just content to make some chump change on the back of a broken mess of a game while giving the middle finger to the small pool of fans that they once had. Good job, guys. You really made a name for yourself last year, and I doubt I'll be playing anything else you make in the future. Another game graced by my godly powers of critique this past year, Lil Guardsman delighted with a surprisingly innovative point-and-click experience that takes inspiration from Lucas Pope's Papers, Please and delivers a game that goes far beyond even that in terms of its pure mechanical intrigue. As the titular Lil, you must take your father's place as a guardsman to one of the several entry points of the city-state of the Sprawl and use your wits, tools, and conversation skills to determine who is fit to enter the city and who is turned away. However, it's the sheer amount of depth that Lil Guardsman has when it comes to showing you both the immediate and long-term consequences of your choices that sets it apart from its sole contemporary. Whereas Papers, Please checked your work and could very easily end your run early for even minor infractions, Lil Guardsman is more than happy to just let things play out. Even large mistakes on the part of the player and moments of greed that benefit you and no one else are taken into account and touched upon later in the game, while the personality of every character you meet and the story of how they all interact with each other is on a whole other level from the often forgettable and cookie-cutter cast of Papers, Please. Make no mistake, there is an optimal solution to every interaction, and the game does allow you to repeat scenarios as much as you like to try for a perfect run, but Hilltop Studios also recognizes how much fun can be had by working with your mistakes, and more importantly, realizes how different outcomes can affect everything else that comes later. I have no idea what Hilltop Studios is working on now, but after playing Lil Guardsman, I'm really excited to see what they come up with next. Surely a game that's going to make several worst of 2024 lists this season is The Inquisitor, a Witcher-style historical fiction action-adventure that takes place in a world where Jesus did not die on the cross, but instead climbed down from it in order to wage war on the entire Roman Empire and become ruler of the Western world. A millennia and a half later, you play as an Inquisitor for the Catholic Church, tasked with hunting down heretics and spawns of Satan in one morally confusing mess after another. Upon its reveal, the game was mocked for its innovative graphics that are straight out of 2008, overall similarity to the Witcher series, and upon its release was raked over many hot coals for being a broken, janky mess of a game. And yet, it managed to garner a bit of a cult following as an intriguing work of Eurojank, a cult that I most definitely consider myself a part of, as overall, I loved the game and found it to be one of the most heartfelt releases of the year, with all of its jank and missteps only adding to its charm and mystique. The outdated graphics also don't bother me, as this happens to be an aesthetic that I tend to have a fondness for, as this is just what most games look like when I got my start as a young video game critic all the way back in 2009, and performance issues aside is how most games of the PS3/Xbox 360 era played and felt, so I adjusted pretty quickly to its controls and jank. I, like many other fans, found its story and world building to be captivating and a breath of fresh air for a genre that tends to lean a bit too heavily on classic Dungeons & Dragons style mythology and medieval tropes, so a more Slavic-inspired Christian world set during the Renaissance is a very welcome change of pace indeed. While its gameplay is at least trying to do something new and interesting as more of a laid-back mystery game rather than a combat-heavy action RPG, despite the fact that it hilariously fails more often than it succeeds. Personally, I'm really hoping for a more fleshed out and polished sequel to this one like we once got with the Witcher games, as I think there's a lot of potential for a detective-style action-adventure such as this. Hopefully developer The Dust will be able to keep their heads above water long enough to see that happen. One of the games that surprised me most last year was Arzette: The Jewel of Faramore, a game that paid homage to a couple of the most universally reviled games of all time, not as a parody, but instead as a spiritual successor. Upon watching its trailer, I didn't really think much of it, and at first I wrote it off entirely as another mocking takedown, yet upon playing it, I found that it was not only a good game, but one of the finest games of the year, and one that takes what is genuinely a great idea laid down by those two infamous Zelda games all those years ago and expands upon them in interesting ways that cause Arzette to end up as far more than just a loving homage, but perhaps the beginning of a new wave of titles that expand upon the failed games of the past and treat them with the dignity and respect a botched work of art deserves. Not too much more to say about Arzette that I haven't already said in my critique, other than this is another one that I'm really looking forward to a sequel for, as I think there's still a lot of room for experimentation within this style of game, and I can't wait to see what Seth Fulkerson and crew come up with next. As someone who's written off most of the AAA game industry in the past several years in order to better focus on the AA and indie scenes, I derived no small amount of pleasure this past year as I watched large companies like Microsoft, EA, Warner Brothers, Ubisoft, and Sony bleed ungodly amounts of cash into the ether with some of the largest and most hilariously tone-deaf flops in video game history, while also floundering about in more than a few PR disasters. The first of these came in the form of Helldivers 2, the first multiplayer shooter I've been slightly interested in playing in well over a decade, and one that was extremely popular during the first few months of the year, and rightfully so, as it seems like a really solid game that I might actually enjoy, as it's the kind of multiplayer I can really get behind, one where I can actually play solo most of the time while indirectly benefiting other players, while in turn their actions do the same for me. However, I ultimately ended up skipping this one due mostly to Sony's overall greed and their kerfuffle with the whole forcing a PSN account upon players who previously didn't need one, including those playing in countries where the PlayStation Network isn't even available, which essentially made the game unplayable for potentially millions of players who had already banked dozens, if not hundreds of hours into the game, forcing Valve to make a metric shit ton of exceptions to their return policy in response to Sony's breach of trust. Sony then later backtracked on this requirement in order to appease the hornet's nest of fans who rightfully raised holy hell over this necessary corporate bullshit, claiming that they wouldn't force a PSN account upon PC gamers after all in response to the backlash, though they did force the same requirement experiment upon the PC port of God of War Ragnarok later in the year, despite that being a single-player game with no online functionality whatsoever, which is arguably worse. Warner Brothers, in its attempt at being the worst publisher of the year, in turn called Sony's bluff by releasing Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, an Arkham City-style live-service open-world blah-blah-blah game that nobody, and I mean nobody, thought was a good idea, but the suits at Warner Brothers and the mutilated corpse of the once great Rocksteady Studios shat out anyway to abysmal reviews and sales, controversy after controversy, and further proof that anything with the words Suicide Squad in its title is, ironically, destined to commit suicide and wind up as a colossal failure. Ubisoft at first appeared as though they were turning over a new leaf after the month of goodwill that followed in the wake of Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, but they apparently saw the fight that was brewing between Warner and Sony and said, "Alright kids, hold my beer, let me show you how it's done," before finally hacking out Skull and Bones, another live service open world blah 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 game inspired by everyone's favorite parts of Assassin's Creed Black Flag that had been in the works for well over a decade. Billed by Ubisoft as the world's first quadruple A game, the only joy that Skull and Bones seemed to manage to drum up was from those who pointed and laughed at the abysmally mediocre train wreck that it is, with graphics that are somehow worse than those which Ubisoft was capable of producing over 10 years ago, the usual bugs and glitches and game-breaking problems the company has a reputation for delivering, and gameplay that is so sparse and repetitive that it was rivaled only by Ubisoft's other colossal failure this year with Star Wars Outlaws. Another supposed quadruple A open world blah 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 game with all of the same issues and failings of Skull and Bones, but with the added sting of being yet another failed Star Wars project that absolutely no one wanted or cared about. Yet even with those two cyclopean failures under their belt, Ubisoft's long-reigning crown of dog shit still managed to slip from their withered head, as nothing could possibly hold a candle to what happened with Concord, Sony's failed Overwatch-style hero shooter that, again, absolutely no one wanted. A now long dead and buried game that will go down in history as quite literally the biggest and most expensive gaming flop of all time. 2 years of pre-production, 8 years of active development, and a supposed budget of $400 million, and Concord launched to abysmal reviews and sales, peaking at a whopping 697 players on Steam, far fewer than the amount of people who actually worked on the game, whose credits are well over an hour long, and being pulled from distribution, the shutting down of its servers, and the immediate closure of developer Firewalk Studios, all within only a couple of weeks after the game's release, most likely so Sony could write this off as a loss on their taxes this year, and a massive loss at that. Never before have we seen a flop like this, and it's likely we never will again. Sony, get your shit together. You're really starting to look like you're only a few years away from taking EA's crown as the worst video game publisher. I don't usually care for roguelike mechanics and randomized gameplay, I really don't like collectible card games, and I don't even care for poker all that much, yet somehow Balatro's ingenious combination of all those disparate elements has created one of the most addicting games I've played all year. This, for me, is the game that surprised me most in 2024, as I never would have guessed that something like this would not only be something I'd be interested in playing, but would actually consider to be one of my favorite games of the year, though it does fall a bit short of making my top 10. And after looking into it a bit, this seems to have been the experience for a lot of players who gave it a reluctant shot based on a friend or YouTuber's recommendation and found it to be a masterpiece of ingenious gameplay that's able to chew through hours of your time without you even noticing. Having to form poker hands to reach a certain point threshold, buying cards that augment your deck and point values and multipliers of your various hands, boss blinds that throw a wrench into the works and force you to get creative and think on your feet, in conjunction with the Flux-style Joker system that further changes the rules on the fly, all combine to form such a gloriously enjoyable gameplay loop that's almost impossible to put down once you've gotten started. I slept on this one pretty much all year and have only been into it for the past month or so, and that might just be my biggest gaming mistake of 2024, as Balatro is, in many ways, a perfect game, the kind of simple to play but difficult to master experience that comes about only once every decade or so. Learn from my mistakes, my precious peppercorn flock, and play this gem among gems if you haven't yet. You might be surprised at just how into it you'll actually be. And here we are again, the game that spawned what might just be the most controversial video I've made since my critique of Yooka-Laylee all the way back in 2017. Penny's Big Breakaway is not a bad game. Actually, I thought it was alright, but I also felt that in its attempts to appeal to mainstream 3D platformer fans, as well as the die-hard Sonic-style momentum-based speedrunning crowd, it split its focus and ended up making a watered-down experience in both cases, and one that does a disservice to both groups of people by not fully committing to one style of play. The game, as even the most ardent Penny fans will admit, is not designed to teach you how to play it well, or even as it's supposedly intended, as the game can very easily be finished by someone who has no interest in speedrunning or learning the finer intricacies of Penny's moveset that make it enjoyable for this type of player. On the surface, this sounds like it would be a good thing until you realize that played this way, the game is one of the most mediocre level-based 3D platformers of the last decade, despite its excellent visuals and music. Yet when played at a high level, the way the speedrunning crowd likes to point to as proof of the game's success, it instead only highlights how inconsequential most of the level design actually is to Penny's movement, as you're barely interacting with it at all. That clearly isn't a problem for those that like to go fast and tinker with the physics of the game, and, you know, fair enough, but you can do that with a lot of mediocre and bad games as well. Just because you're able to do something fun in a game doesn't mean that it's a good game. To my godlike gaze, this only reveals a game that doesn't have enough faith in its own target audience to focus entirely on them, choosing instead to try and onboard players who have no interest in this speedrun, momentum-based platforming style, even if they realize that that's what the game should be about anyway. You, the momentum-based platforming fans of the world, are a passionate group of gamers who deserve a game made just for you that's not held back by the baggage of trying for mainstream appeal, and whether you'll admit it or not, Penny's Big Breakaway is not that game, and despite the fact that you all hate my guts for pointing that out, I'm nevertheless going to keep on fighting for you and advocating for the momentum-based 3D platformer that you all very much deserve. I, like many, eagerly awaited the release of Dragon's Dogma 2, as it looked as though it would build upon the interesting gameplay of the original cult classic without sacrificing the heart of what made that game so unique. I, like many, was dismayed at Capcom's inclusion of microtransactions into a single-player game, Day 1 DLC and pre-order bonuses de nouveau DRM, and the shoehorning of a AAA mentality upon what was previously a niche little series. I, like many, found that upon launch day the game was impossible to play even on the lowest graphical settings on PC, while it barely chugged along on console. I, like many, was discouraged to learn that even when the game does function, it's about the most bland and boring experience that's somehow even more bare bones than its decade-old counterpart. I, like many, returned the game and never looked back. In my critique, I alluded to the fact that, at the time, Pepper Grinder was my pick for Game of the Year, and while that has definitely changed, what hasn't changed is the fact that I still think this is one fantastic little game that, even half a year after my most recent playthrough, still manages to take the number 6 spot in my top 10 games of the year. Using your drill to dive in and out of the ground and interact with the world, rocketing through the air with your grapple hook, and racing the clock in some of the most challenging and enjoyable time trials I've ever experienced in any game ever, all the while rocking out to some kickin' drum and bass tunes and drinking in that gorgeous pixel art, Pepper Grinder is a damn near perfect game, one where everything just fits together to form something far greater than the sum of its parts, minus the whole gacha mechanic sticker book thing. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm not really much for speedrunning personally, but something about Pepper Grinder's level design combined with its flow and pacing really makes me want to go fast and push the mechanics of the game to their very limits in order to accomplish my speedy goals. But unlike Penny's Big Breakaway, the game's level design actually reflects this higher level of play and rewards players for their keen eye as well as their quick reflexes. Pepper Grinder is a blast at both a low level of skill as well as a high level of skill, but nowhere does it feel like developer RX compromised in order to cater to both groups of players. Rather, he developed the game for himself and trusted that there were other players out there who would enjoy it too. And that's how it's done. That's how you follow your heart and trust the muse. That's what makes a damn fine game, and Pepper Grinder is, indeed, a damn fine game. Children of the Sun was a bit of a surprise hit in early spring last year before seemingly disappearing into the ether after everyone had moved on to something else. Armed only with a sniper rifle and your telekinetic powers, you must complete each level by carefully positioning yourself to take out all of the cultists in the area with a single shot. However, upon hitting an enemy, you'll be able to completely change the direction of your bullet to hit another target, as well as make a few adjustments like bending your bullet around obstacles in between hits. It's a fantastic little idea for a game, and one that's hard to put down once you get a feel for it. While it's its visuals and sound design elevate the whole experience to something damn near mesmerizing. This is another one I graced with my godly game criticism powers, and while overall I enjoyed it, I also felt that it played it a bit too safe by not digging as deep as it could have with these interesting mechanics, as well as being far too timid in its exploration of psychopathy and the darker aspects of human nature. Still, this is a game that I'd gladly recommend as a unique puzzler or to those just looking for something different in the sea of bland sameness that often typifies the indie scene in recent years. Give it a shot, no pun intended, as overall it's a lot of fun. This year we got a couple of what I'm going to call minimal interaction games. That is, games that have more hands-on control than something like a visual novel, but also don't really have a whole lot going on in the mechanical department either, with most of the gameplay spent actually just walking around and talking to other characters. This is the kind of game that years ago I probably would have written off entirely, but recently it's a type of experience I'm really coming to appreciate as its own distinct genre that fits somewhere between visual novels and point-and-click adventure games, and both of the games I played this year that fall into this category really couldn't exist in any other format or medium, which I think is a key distinction to make when judging whether or not they succeed as video games and as works of art. The first of these was Halibut, a lovingly and painstakingly crafted stop-motion wonder of science fiction that follows the day-to-day life of its eponymous character as he interacts with his fellow colonists aboard a spaceship that once crash-landed in the ocean of an alien planet and has now spent several generations living beneath its waves. As a minimal interaction game, the dialogue and story is thrust front and center while the gameplay takes a back seat, and what a gloriously enjoyable little story it is, and one that's such a breath of fresh air as a work of science fiction, especially among those typically found in video games, which are almost always, without exception, cut from the same archetypal cloth. Each and every character in Halibut is a treat as well, and the way they all play off of and complement one another is truly something to behold. Despite this game having very little in the way of actual gameplay, it's still a fantastic experience from start to finish, and a monumental leap for the rare blend that is stop-motion video games. The other of these minimal interaction games that came out later in the year is Thank Goodness You're Here, a game that, like Halibut, is simply a game about wandering around and interacting with various wacky characters and finding yourself in bizarre and often hilarious situations. Thank Goodness has a bit more in the way of interaction with some small puzzles and challenges here and there, but the point of the game is simply to drink in the excellent animation and goofy situations that are presented before you while marveling at how interconnected it all is and how expertly the developers manage to set up jokes and gags without you even realizing that that's what they're doing. Sometimes giving you the punchline early on with the context needed to get the joke only being provided much later near the end of the game, which causes you to burst out laughing when you realize how expertly you've been played. The point is that there's room for these kinds of games that don't have much interaction and traditional gameplay, as long as those games are works of art that can't exist in any other format, and both Halibut and Thank Goodness You're Here fit that bill, and I just can't recommend either enough. The Souls-like genre, as I've said before, has never really been my cup of tea. Yes, I adore the Souls series proper, but every other game that I've played that's aping the style of FromSoft's 7 masterpieces has fallen far short of being worth a damn, even if they happen to feature some enjoyable gameplay. For example, I just don't feel that same sense of heartful design when I play something like Lies of P. Even though I think it's a pretty damn good game, it just oozes with this desperate energy to copy the work of a developer that's on a whole other level, rather than drawing from the creative and personal well of the people that are actually crafting it. And this is a problem I have with every Souls-like, because they all do that. They have no identity of their own. They're all chasing FromSoft's tail and trying to catch up rather than carving their own path. That is, until Another Crab's Treasure came along last year and showed the world how you make a Souls-like that has enough artistic integrity to take things in its own direction. This is what I meant when I said in my critique that Another Crab's Treasure is the best Souls-like, that it's the first to really evolve the genre beyond merely copying FromSoft's work, a trend that I hope continues as this glorious blend of Souls combat and 3D platforming is a real treat, and one that I hope is further expanded upon one day. And while the game definitely has its problems, especially with its ending, which is utterly abysmal and unfortunately undermines much of the whole experience, overall it's a fantastic take on the Souls-like formula that has enough new and innovative ideas, themes, and settings to make it stand out as something that transcends rather than copies. Of all the games released this past year, none have really gripped me as much as Animal Well in terms of sheer obsession. As mentioned in my critique, for a solid 2 weeks I lived for Animal Well, breathed for Animal Well, woke up in the mornings to play more Animal Well, and usually only to make a minuscule amount of progress deeper into its depths with each and every play session. That is, until it occurred to me that I was on a fool's errand and that much of Animal Well is not meant to be played in this obsessive manner, but rather taken as a community ARG, which, you know, fair enough, as that seems to be exactly what most fans of the game liked about it, but for me, it ended up souring a bit of the magic, as I find ARGs to, overall, be a flash-in-the-pan gimmick that once solved leaves the game in question that they're built on top of, now with a needless amount of fluff and baggage that can no longer be interacted with on any meaningful level, and which will only distract from the core of the game that isn't tied to the ARG experience. And as much as I adore Animal Well, I still stand by that assessment. Animal Well would have been a much better video game had the community ARG elements been toned back or removed entirely, but I recognize I'm very much in the minority on that one, and the only people who are probably going to understand this sentiment are those that come to the game for the first time years from now after the hype has long since died down and are confused as to why this was such a big deal when it was first released. Yet despite my criticism of it, I can't deny that Animal Well is a masterpiece of Metroidvania puzzle design. Even if you ignore all of the ARG elements and focus solely on the core single-player experience, the game is still profoundly deep and very rewarding, equal parts engaging and intriguing, which just goes to show how excellent it is that I could have such a major criticism of it and still put it in the number 4 spot in my list of the best games of the year. Animal Well is just that good. Later in the video, I'm going to talk about more survival horror games that made 2024 special, but Crow Country by SFB Games very much deserves its own spot, as it acts as both an homage to and a deconstruction of the Resident Evil style horror game in an exceedingly interesting world filled with unique and relatable characters, all of which combines to land it squarely at number 7 on my list of the best games of the year. Crow Country is a bit of an odd mix of tones in that it takes place in a creepy theme park with an unnerving vibe, yet the matter-of-fact manner in which the characters react and the way things actually progress causes it all to feel quite humorous most of the time, a mixture of emotions that creates an atmosphere that's uniquely its own. This is further helped by the fact that Crow Country, more so than any other horror game I've played all year, is just a blast to play. Normally, I prefer my horror games to be uncomfortable and disturbing and even a little frustrating, but I can't deny how much gleeful fun I had during both of my playthroughs of this modern masterpiece of the survival horror genre. But during my time spent with it, I also noticed something deeper and more sinister going on, which sends a shiver up my spine and chills me to the very bone in the subtlest yet most profound of ways, an aspect of Crow Country that I feel a lot of other players seem to have overlooked completely when it comes to the true horror at the heart of the game. Because ultimately the nightmare of Crow Country is not the monstrosities that roam the park, nor the machinations of the park's owner, Edward Crow, as you might expect, but the sheer cosmic uncertainty of circumstance. No one in Crow Country is evil, no one is setting out to do the wrong thing. Not the monsters, not the people, not the park itself, not society or some other trite bullshit like that, but instead each and every character and creature is simply doing the best they can with the circumstances they find themselves in, yet they all pay dearly for it. I won't say any more for fear of spoiling the game for those who haven't yet played, but for those who have, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That, to me, is what makes Crow Country so special, that it revels in the freedom that comes with sheer and utter hopelessness, accepting one's fate and making do with what you have. It's fun because it's bleak, it's joyous because there's simply no other option. I am an old woman. Lorelei and the Laser Eyes, like Animal Well, was another game that I sort of became obsessed with this past year, though admittedly not quite to the same degree. A synapse-bursting puzzle game that is much, much deeper than a first glance would reveal, Lorelei and the Laser Eyes is a museum of every type of puzzle you can imagine, from riddles and number puzzles, optical illusions, quizzes, combination inference, sliding puzzles, zodiac puzzles, movement puzzles, puzzles that require careful research of exoteric text, transposition puzzles, word puzzles, perspective puzzles, and so much more. All of which is seamlessly interwoven into one cohesive whole that almost has the structure and pacing of a survival horror or a Metroidvania, despite this not being a survival horror or a Metroidvania, while the story and characters and how both are presented piecemeal to you goes far beyond what you would normally find in a game such as this. A narrative that comments on the interplay between art and artists, society and culture, interactivity and play as an overlooked mode of artistic expression, as well as a subtle commentary on developer Simogo's own place as a group of of artists working within the medium of video games, all of which is so richly developed and so expertly presented to you that it gives you plenty to mull over in the interim between solving puzzles. But it doesn't lower itself by falling into the ARG trap either. Unlike Animal Well, Lorelei and the Laser Eyes is a game that can very realistically be solved by a single person, but it isn't going to make it easy for you either, as some of the puzzles are really out there and can take days of pondering and mulling over your ever-growing pile of post-it notes in order to solve. The perfect game for a determined and obsessive soul such as myself. This is a game that engaged me and rewarded me for my commitment more so than any other game this past year. A true masterpiece and now high watermark of the puzzle genre that, had it not been for a couple of expansions to two of my favorite games of all time, would have absolutely been my game of the year. Instead, it makes the number 3 spot just ever so slightly ahead of Animal Well. What an absolute banger. Cryptmaster was a surprising mixture of a dungeon-crawling RPG with a typing game that, at least in its early hours, was a damn good one at that. The idea of making everything about the game based on letters, from the puzzles and riddles you solve to your mana pool to the health bar of both characters and enemies, as well as your experience points and how you cast spells, is such an ingenious abstraction of classic RPG mechanics that shows how it really doesn't take all that much to innovate when you're willing to get creative and set artistic limitations for yourself. That said, this is a game that I unfortunately didn't like as much as I wish I did, as I found this interesting set of mechanics to be far too bare bones to carry a whole game, while the creative spark that birthed the game in the first place only ever scratches the surface of the potential a game like this really has. I also found the exploration to be extremely tedious and inconsequential to the progression of the game, little more than filler that kills the pacing for no other reason than to pad out the gameplay and provide some downtime in between character interactions and combat. Dungeon crawlers are made or broken by the quality of their exploration, and it pains me to say that this is one of the most mediocre dungeons I've ever crawled around in, sinking the overall quality of the game while the developers focus on the bells and whistles and often unnecessary accessibility options clearly cut into precious dev time that could have been better used shoring up the core gameplay loop and level design. Still, this is far from a bad game, and one that I feel will yet go down in history as a crucial landmark for much better and more artistically sound games that follow in its wake and take inspiration from its unique sets of mechanics, and I really hope that's the case. So I bought Senua Saga Hellblade 2 on release day with the intention of critiquing it, but never actually ended up playing it. Part of that was because I didn't really want a sequel to Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, despite me putting it in the number 5 spot on my list of the best games of 2017 back in the day, as I felt the game had the perfect ending, and any sequel would only tarnish its accomplishments. Then there was the fact that between the release of the two games, Microsoft had purchased the game's developer Ninja Theory, and Microsoft has a bad habit of buying and immediately destroying promising game studios by forcing them to make corporate dog shit rather than the kinds of games the developer in question actually wants to make. Then there was the fact that for well over a month I was unable to get the game to boot at all due to some DirectX 12 nonsense, something that's becoming increasingly more common for games published by Xbox Game Studios, which is both sad and hilarious, and by the time I finally did get it to launch, I had lost all interest in it completely based on the objective fact that it would only be a couple of hours long if you cut out all the cutscenes and cinematic moments, while those 2 hours of actual gameplay look bland as fuck. In hindsight, I probably should have just returned the game when I had the chance, and based on what I've seen, it appears I'm not the only one that feels that way. Of all the games released this past year, Nine Souls is the one I regret not critiquing most, as it's criminally underrated as the best Metroidvania of the year, second only to Animal Well, which of course lands it squarely at number 5 in my list of the best games of the year. Set in a futuristic Dowpunk world brought to life by a gorgeous hand-drawn aesthetic and jaw-dropping animation, Nine Souls takes the well-worn foundation of Metroidvania design and throws in a Sekiro-style parry and deflection combat system that come together to form one of the most difficult yet rewarding games I've played all year. This game isn't for the faint of heart, as even though I'm an old hand at Metroidvanias and Souls games, I still got my ass kicked and got it kicked hard, to the point that, and it pains me to admit this, I haven't actually beaten the game yet, which is the main reason I didn't end up critiquing it. And if you know anything about me as a gamer and a critic, not finishing a game is something I rarely do, but Nine Souls managed to best me, and I had to accept defeat in order to not miss out on some other games I wanted to play around this time. Yet I never once felt like it was unfair or that the game was poorly designed. Quite the contrary, I think it's perfectly balanced for what it's trying to accomplish, and that I'm just not yet skilled enough to keep up with that. And that makes it very enticing to me as an undefeated foe that I can look forward to one day beating. And maybe this year, when the deluge of game releases finally slows down for a while, I'll be able to do just that. Still, I've played enough of the game, roughly 3/4 or so by my calculations, that I can confidently call it one of my favorite games of the year, and one that I'm happy to have a grudge match with in the future as a worthy rival to my godly powers. I will return to you soon, Nine Souls, and I will defeat you. Now, normally I don't count DLC among new game releases, and in my decade and a half as a game critic, I've never once included an expansion among my lists of the best games of a given year. Not because I think DLC is somehow a lesser experience than the base game it's a part of, though that is usually the case, but more so because I've never really played an expansion that I felt was substantial enough that it could stand separate from the larger game that it's a part of, which is why 2024 was such a surprise for me, and that my top 2 games of the year are actually both expansions to previously released games. Longtime viewers of the channel may remember that my Game of the Year for 2023's recap video was the Talos Principle 2, a game that a year on is still criminally overlooked by the vast majority of gamers, most of whom don't even seem to be aware of its existence. And this past summer, Crow Team released a massive epilogue for that monumental game with the Road to Elysium pack, which features 3 separate standalone adventures, each of which dive further into the already exceedingly deep gameplay the base game is known for, that combined form an experience that's almost large enough to stand on its own as a full game. Orpheus Ascending took the ubiquitous laser puzzles the series is known for and pushed their logic to the very limit, showing that these sets of mechanics still have plenty of room for experimentation. Isles of the Blessed delighted as an epilogue for the story of the main game, while delivering more challenging puzzles that combine all of the previously established mechanics, as well as a few new ones, into one massive interconnected set piece. And Into the Abyss delivered a brutally difficult collection of puzzles which force you to interact with the game and its tools in ways you previously didn't even know was possible, providing one of the most challenging and rewarding experiences I've had all year. So much so that even in a year packed with incredibly enjoyable and innovative games, it still manages to nab the number 2 spot on my list of games of the year. Much like with my time spent with the base game, Road to Elysium had me entranced from start to finish, adding 30 joyous hours of gameplay to my already substantial time invested into 2023's best. And had it not been for another expansion that released around the same time, the Talos Principle 2 would have easily been my game of the year for 2 years running. However, damn. Yeah, so surprising absolutely no one, my pick for game of the year is Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree expansion. Looks like my days of simping for From Software are far from over. Don't get me wrong, I love Elden Ring, but I've never considered it my favorite of the Souls series and have always ranked it closer to the bottom, well behind Dark Souls 1 and 2, Sekiro, and Bloodborne. Like, it's still amazing, but I've always felt that something special about the series was lost in order to make it open world. And while since its release I've maintained that Elden Ring is the best open world game, I still feel that there's too much empty space, reused content, and filler added that distracts from the core of the game, while the bosses are far easier and more simplistic in their design, despite their flashier natures. Tight level design and challenging bosses that seem insurmountable and get my heart racing as I barely scrape by is what drew me to the series in the first place, and while Elden Ring definitely still has those aspects, I can't deny that they've been toned down a bit, and despite its grand nature, it never really reaches the same heights that most of its predecessors did. But then Shadow of the Erdtree comes along and fixes every issue I had with the main game by giving us the best level design in video game history, bar none, condensing the open world into a smaller, more intimate setting that is then filled with meaningful interactions rather than repetitious filler, in addition to some of the coolest, best designed, and most challenging bosses I've ever had the pleasure to have hand me my own ass on a silver platter. I was worried most about balancing for this one and wondered how FromSoft would handle the fact that most players are going to have a high-level build by the time they can access the DLC and would likely stomp anything that stood in their way, missing out on that crucial feeling of accomplishment that only this series of games has yet to really deliver, yet my my fears were completely unfounded thanks to the ingenious shadow fragments that act as a leveling system separate from your core abilities. A feature which was actually very contentious to a lot of players who were just used to power leveling at the bird farm and optimizing the meaning and fun right out of the game, but screw them because this shit's brilliant and provides an incentive to take the time to explore this rich and engrossing world and allowing you to invest your runes into attributes you might not normally utilize in order to try out the wonderfully strange and unique arsenal that's been added on top of a game that already has hundreds of different weapons and tools to make use of. This is such a brilliant system, and I really hope something like it makes a return in FromSoft's next Souls game, as it would force people to actually have to explore and get good again, weeding out the players that probably shouldn't be playing this kind of game anyway, especially the toxic ones that so quickly ruined Elden Ring's multiplayer. Is that sentiment elitist? Sure is. Do I care? No. Shadow of the Erdtree seems to have been a bit divisive for a lot of Elden Ring fans who were probably only hoping for more of the same, but for me, the DLC is proof that, once again, FromSoft are the best at what they do, and always seek to outdo themselves with each and every release and push the limits of their own capabilities as artists working in this medium, regardless if what they're doing is what their fans want and expect. Case in point with Night Rain, which I have very mixed feelings about, but hey, ignoring the feelings of their most diehard fans is how they've gotten so good in the first place, so I guess I'm all for it. Elden Ring proper may be a lesser entry in the Souls series, which of course still makes it incredible, but Shadow of the Erdtree might just be the best thing that From Software has ever made, and man, is that saying something. This right here is the pinnacle of gaming, the culmination of everything I want to see from an artist working in this medium, a trust in the muse and a following of the heart, which is why I can confidently say, even after 3 separate playthroughs, that it's not only my game of the year, but probably my favorite game released in the last 10 years. A masterpiece among masterpieces, a god among gods. If you were to have asked me what games I was looking forward to most for 2024, Frogun Encore would have been near the top of my list, as the original Frogun was my favorite game of 2022, second only to Elden Ring. Yet Frogun Encore turned out to be less than ideal. It's not a bad game, far from it in fact. I think it's pretty damn good, and I've had 3 very enjoyable playthroughs of it so far, but when compared to the original, this feels like a 1 step forward, 2 steps back sort of sequel. In many ways, the game is better than its predecessor. The controls are tighter, Renata has an expanded moveset that makes the original feel downright unfinished in comparison, and almost all of the rough edges have been smoothed down and polished to a mirror sheen. But in doing so, the game lost much of its texture, much of what made the original such an underrated innovation in the world of 3D platformers. A game that feels ashamed of its predecessor and looks back upon it as a failure because it's so different from other games in the genre, when being different was what made it so special in the first place. The now fixed camera angle and flat level design, while certainly more streamlined, just doesn't have the same level of personality or creativity behind it. Again, Frogun Encore is still a lot of fun despite this, but most of the magic of the original is just gone, replaced with an experience that's far more competent on a technical level, but also more similar to every 3D platformer that came before it, a far cry from the wellspring of innovation and risk-taking that defined the first game. Hopefully this is just a necessary stepping stone to something far greater. If we ever get a Frogun 3, and I really hope we do, I hope it's a game that has the structure and level design that builds upon the first game, with the controls and maneuvers that build upon the second, because if combined, we could very well have a Super Mario Odyssey / A Hat in Time level masterpiece on our hands, and God, I hope that's the case one day. Something I'm really coming to appreciate in the wake of the Breath of the Wild style Zelda games is how their popularity has inspired so many smaller creators to take this type of laid-back open world style of exploration those games pioneered and use it as an excuse to craft a completely new type of open world game, one that further leans into that laid-back nature and dials back the need for combat, action, and the usual quest-driven pacing that typifies the genre, providing you one massive sandbox for you to explore and mess around in without your self-directed fun constantly getting interrupted by needless combat and NPC interactions, as is the case with Breath and Tears. Tchia is one such game, and a damn good one at that, as its goal is essentially to just faff around in this gloriously realized open world archipelago and see what kind of trouble you can get yourself into during what is basically a 20+ hour scavenger hunt, the items of which you collect further unlocking more tasks, abilities, and costumes for you to augment your fun. But it's Tchia's movement and physics that really makes it for me. Like many games in this vein, you have a glider mechanic and can climb almost anything, anything, but you're also able to slide down a slope to gain enormous amounts of speed and momentum, fling yourself from treetops, quickly scale a mountainside as a deer, rocket through the waves as a dolphin or a fish, or cross an entire island in seconds as a bird. This is the kind of game that's just a joy to move around in, so Nintendo, I hope you're taking notes for your next open world Zelda game, because Link's got nothing on my girl Tchia here in terms of smooth and enjoyable movement mechanics. There is a story and a main quest, and it's a pretty good one at that, while the character interactions, humor, and scenarios are far different from what you would expect for a game such as this, but all of that takes a back seat to the core gameplay of wandering the wilderness, possessing animals a la Mario Odyssey, and collecting trinkets, stamina fruits, hundreds of outfits and accessories, and just having one chill-ass time. This is the kind of game that's probably going to be labeled as boring and pointless by those who don't understand the appeal of the cozy game, even one as fleshed out as this, but for me, Tchia was a treasure from start to finish, and one that was far more engaging than its seemingly bare-bones gameplay had me expecting. The perfect game to unwind to at the end of a long day, and one that is just the right length and size for an open-world experience such as this, and the game that hits the number 10 spot on my games of the year. I've played a lot of Mega Man clones, and every year there seems to be more and more of them as neophyte developers looking to cash in on that wave of retro nostalgia that has actually long since died down seek to recreate the experience they remember from when they were young, but do it bigger and better than the wizards at Capcom once did now that we're not limited by hardware restraints and storage limitations, or so the thinking goes. Yet almost all of these end up as just a worse version of the NES classics that have few, if any, new ideas, interesting scenarios, and unique mechanics to fill the bloated mess of a game that's often created. Fallen Leaf, however, is one of the few Mega Man inspired games that seems to understand that if you want to build upon the classic jump and shoot platformer, you've got to dig really deep. So, dig really deep, it does. Presented in a glorious pseudo 8-bit style a la Shovel Knight and featuring some of the best 2D platforming level design I've ever seen, Fallen Leaf is much more than just a Mega Man clone, but a true successor that shows just how much more mileage we can wring out of this style of play if only we're willing to drop the nostalgia bait design and mix things up, subvert expectations, and just overall foster a level of creativity that isn't afraid to deviate from the established formula when it comes to how we design games that are taking inspiration from the classics. My only real gripe with Fallen Leaf is that there are way too many playable characters whose abilities aren't really reflected in the level design, while the game very much overstays its welcome with roughly a dozen or so unnecessary levels that just aren't up to the same level of quality as the rest of the game. Still, if too much content is the only thing I have to complain about, the developers must have done something right. There's something magical that seems to happen to popular artistic mediums during times of uncertainty, a combination of anxiety about one's world mixing with a desire to counteract these intense emotions has a way of causing the media in question to get a bit silly from time to time, perhaps as a way to transmute the unease one is feeling into something more positive, or to simply look the absurdity of our world dead in the eye and accept it as it is through metaphor and allegory. In that regard, the current popularity of video games as a medium, as well as the influx of new developers looking to make a name for themselves with something strange that causes people to stop and pay attention to them, seems to have combined to form yet another one of these surrealist movements. Strange, offbeat, and psychedelic games have been around for a while now, but 2024 seems to have been the year when this trend finally cemented itself as a full-blown artistic movement. Games like Psychopomp, which combine first-person horror mechanics with dungeon-crawling elements and a bizarre world of strange creatures living below the Earth's surface with biomechanical monstrosities that hint at an unhinged reality likely to implode at any given moment, walk dangerously far out onto their conceptual limb, worrying little about alienating or confusing players with their strange worlds and incomprehensible lore, showing just how much mileage can be gained by combining seemingly disparate elements and throwing out the idea of standard progression systems entirely. Likewise, Arctic Eggs was an absurd take on the cooking genre that sees you finding and cooking breakfast for the offbeat residents of an Antarctic colony using only your trusty portable frying pan and whatever ingredients each hungry denizen requests or gives you, all the while piecing together more and more of this game's strange backstory and surprisingly deep world building. Rat Shaker was a bananas first-person scavenger hunt in which you must shake and squeeze a talking rat in order to build up the energy to interact with the world around you, as if the poor creature is one of those self-powering flashlights you find in the as seen on TV aisle at Walmart. Click Holding was a unique clicker that saw you locked in a hotel room with a mysterious character who's offering to solve all of your problems if you click from 0 to 10,000 while following special instructions and listening to his strange thoughts and confusing life story, but its offbeat world that apparently features clicking as a championship sport, combined with its uncomfortable sexual overtones, leads to by far one of the most engaging clickers I've ever played. Mouthwashing was a wacky horror game from the creators of How Fish Is Made about the crew of a space freighter who crash land on an alien planet and are forced to break into the ship's cargo bay in order to survive, but find only thousands of boxes of mouthwash, which they promptly use to go on a multi-week bender of ethanol-fueled madness that forces them to come to terms with the darkest parts of themselves and each other. Velveeta was an RPG Maker title that followed the alcoholic knight Pavel and his comrades as they run all over northern Hungary to reveal and stop the plans of a local cult who's using the flaming head of an ancient Zoroastrian god of death to roast coffee beans, which are then used to transform people into eldritch abominations, and the game is presented with some of the strangest yet oddly compelling visuals and sound design I've seen since the seminal classic Off. Indico was a bizarre linear adventure that followed the journey of a Satan-possessed nun and an escaped criminal with a rotting arm as they traverse the snowy wilderness to find a holy relic which will hopefully solve both of their problems, and in the process delivers a game that is very matter-of-fact with these strange happenings that make up the entire experience, almost as if everything that happens is a perfectly normal, everyday occurrence when it's anything but. A fantastic little game with some clever puzzles that managed to enthrall me from start to finish before, unfortunately, ending on a bit of a whimper just as it's really beginning to pick up some steam. And Dread Delusion was a Morrowind-inspired first-person RPG exploration game that, while not quite as strange as the previously mentioned titles, still leaned heavily into the odder elements of this surrealist brood, giving us a game that feels both fresh and familiar, with well-worn mechanics that are recontextualized and used in new and creative ways thanks to the game's quirky and at times disturbing thematics, laid-back adventuring, and a unique tone that unfortunately flew under the radar for most fans of the genre. For a solid month, Black Myth Wukong was the hottest game around and was smashing records left and right, looking to many as though it might even make Game of the Year. And for a lot of people, I think that's very much the case. But for me, probably not, which is why I ended up skipping it. I do want to play it eventually, but it's a pretty low priority for me at the moment as it just doesn't look like anything special to me. Don't get me wrong, it looks good, damn good even, but I've yet to see any mechanic, boss fight, or set pieces that stand out as anything other than the same type of tropes and encounters I've played in dozens of other games, just with a different coat of paint. And there's nothing wrong with that. If all this is a solid character action game a la Ninja Gaiden mixed with some Souls-like elements, I can definitely see the appeal, but as someone who's played far more of this type of game than the average player, that's not really enough to draw me to it, which is why I'll be waiting until the game is heavily discounted on Steam before giving it a shot. Still, I wanted to at least mention it because I know it has a lot of fans, and maybe once I play it, I'll be able to count myself among them. There's a well-known phenomenon that happens in the final year of a Nintendo console's life cycle, which is that the company has a tendency to all but abandon their current hardware in favor of setting themselves up for the following generation, and the Nintendo Switch seems to have already been quietly put to bed this past year, as 2024 was one of the blandest year for Nintendo releases in quite some time. First out of the gate for them was Mario vs. Donkey Kong, a remake of the classic GBA title of the same name, which itself was a reimagining of the Game Boy Classic, and this pretty much set the tone for what to expect from the Big N, as several of their other releases were merely ports or remasters of previously released games, such as with Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door and Luigi's Mansion 2 finally making their way to the Switch. Yet even their truly new releases failed to be anything special. Princess Peach Showtime was by far the most mediocre game I played all year that, despite having a few good ideas here and there and a wave of positive response in the weeks that followed its release, has already been long forgotten by even the most die-hard Nintendo fans and will likely be looked back upon with disdain in the coming years, even among those who initially enjoyed it. Mario and Luigi Brothership was another watered-down, gimmick-laden release into the cult classic series that got decent enough praise and reviews, but seemed to have been an overall letdown for most fans as yet another boring entry into what once was one of the most offbeat and interesting Nintendo franchises. Emil the Smiling Man, the first new entry in the ancient Famicom detective series in over 30 years, seems to have been a smash hit among fans of the series, but completely underwhelmed everyone else since visual novels are, by their very nature, a niche genre. Still, this is probably the most heartfelt Nintendo release of the year, as it's clear that it's a game whose developers really cared about the project, despite knowing that it wasn't going to gain much traction or appeal to more than a handful of people, at least outside of Japan. It's certainly Nintendo's best work of the year, but one that very few will actually enjoy. And that was pretty much it for Nintendo, except that one game that you're thinking of. Don't worry, it's coming up soon, but you're not gonna like it. I don't have a PS5 and haven't been plugged into Sony's first-party releases for a while now, since most of them I'm not interested in the slightest, so while I was vaguely aware of Astro Bot's release, I sort of just assumed it was only an update to Astro's Playroom, the tech demo that ships with every PS5. It wasn't until Astro Bot's controversial pick as Game of the Year at the Game Awards that I realized that it was not only a separate title, but also a 3D Mario-inspired platformer that looked to be right up my alley. So borrowing a friend's PS5, I played through it in a few days, and I'm really glad I did, because Astro Bot is a hell of a good time, one of the most purely fun games I've played all year, with one unfortunate caveat. Essentially a Sony-branded mashup of Super Mario's Sunshine, Galaxy, and Odyssey with a sprinkling of other 3D platforming classics like Crash and Spyro, and even a little Rayman 2 and 3 thrown in for good measure, Astro Bot wows with its varied and expertly crafted levels, tone, and pace that's, for the most part, flawless, while the sheer graphical spectacle of it all that never once drops a frame or glitches out is truly something to behold. Ultimately, Astro Bot isn't really doing anything new, nothing that I can't ascribe to at least a dozen other 3D platformers, but what it lacks in mechanical innovation, it more than makes up for with its high level of polish and balancing that isn't afraid to pull from many different sources and piece them together in new and interesting ways without any of it feeling forced. Well, for the most part, as I do have one pretty big issue with Astro Bot, that issue being its obscene amount of Sony and PlayStation branding, which frequently jumps the shark from being a fun little reference and callback and lands squarely in the realm of aggressive and forced marketing. Like, this may be nothing but harmless fun to those of you who are so brainwashed by AAA companies that you equate nostalgia with love and appreciation for one's fans, but I'm not buying it. It's gross when Nintendo does it, and it's gross when Sony does it, and if you can honestly enjoy something like this without feeling at least a little icky, well then you're part of the problem. Honestly, I don't have an issue with referencing other games, or even the brand itself to some extent, but when it's done to this level where many of the very textures of the game are PlayStation branded, you're no longer making a meaningful reference, but instead indoctrinating the player into branded icon worship. I actually really enjoyed the little cameos of some of the bots you rescue being costumed after well-known characters that were once central to PlayStation consoles, but some of the levels themed after God of War Ragnarok or Uncharted or Horizon feel so forced and out of place, less like a playful homage and more like a corporate mandated marketing ploy meant only to further stoke the fires of devotion to the brand. But then, in contrast, there are levels themed instead after Ape Escape and Loco Roco, two series made by Japan Studio, many of whose members now formed Astro Bot's developer Team Asobi, two long-dead cult classic Sony franchises that show how heartfelt and meaningful a themed level callback to another series can be when you are, actually paying homage rather than just appeasing marketing suits and fanboy expectations. Astro Bot is a game that is an absolute joy to play, but at times it just feels so gross, as if I'm not playing a work of art, but a commodity, an advertisement, a throwaway, nostalgia-fueled product. By all means, enjoy the game. It's overall very good, but Astro Bot is at its best when the branding takes a back seat and the game is simply allowed to be itself, not quite literally morph into other brands for the sake of making a forced reference at best, or a soulless work of marketing at worst. UFO 50 isn't a game, it's 50 games. Not 50 WarioWare-styled micro-games, not 50 bite-sized demos or game jams, but 50 fully realized, feature-rich, retro-inspired games in one package. And it's one of the most impressive achievements of the year. Billed as a collection of unreleased titles for the fictional LX series of consoles, each game aims to expand upon classic retro game tropes and mechanics, as well as act as an excuse to experiment like it's going out of style, all the while building a compelling narrative around the fictional company and employees that birthed each and every one of these hidden gems. Games like Mortal 2 and Porgy are two standouts for me as a unique take on puzzle platforming and a Motherlode-inspired Metroidvania, respectively, while Mini and Max is a wonderfully innovative adventure title that sees you growing and shrinking to bypass obstacles and solve problems for the denizens of this little world. Pin Golf was an interesting mix of pinball and mini golf, Camouflage, a deviously engaging puzzle game about blending in with the background, Valbrace, an innovative action dungeon crawler, Danger, a gravity-swapping Metroidvania, Magic Garden, a difficult classic arcade game, Mooncat, a weird platformer with backwards controls, and those are just the ones that grab my attention most, as even months later, I feel like I've really only scratched the surface of this monolith of of a game collection. Nearly all of these games are strong enough and large enough that they could be sold individually for a few bucks and find an audience no problem, and a lesser, greedier developer probably could have gotten away with doing just that. But Mossmouth is clearly a company with too much integrity and an artistic drive to give into that temptation or give up on a project with a scope as large as this one, as it took them 8 years to see it through from start to finish. UFO 50 doesn't quite make my top 10, but it's still one of the greatest achievements of the year, and a must-play for any fan of retro games looking for something new to sink their teeth into that goes well beyond the usual nostalgic callbacks. Very highly recommended. Along with Penny's Big Breakaway, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom was my most controversial critique of 2024, since I called it the most disappointing game of the year, which I still stand by. And as you might imagine, that sentiment wasn't taken too kindly by many of the Zelda fans who stumbled upon my humble video, which personally I'd consider to be the finest critique I made all year. In a year with Skull and Bones, Star Wars Outlaws, Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League, and Concord, how can this possibly be the most disappointing game of the year? Cried more than a few people in my ever-spicy comment section. Well, that's easy. I knew those games were going to be bad, and they didn't disappoint. They're god-awful, but I was expecting Echoes of Wisdom to be really good based on how much I loved the Link's Awakening remake, and the unique ecosystem that was shown off in all of its trailers just looked so cool, but ultimately the game was just fine, slightly better than mediocre, and god is that disappointing. The crux of my critique was that the game's central mechanic of the objectively amazing ecosystem isn't utilized to any meaningful degree, that while you can do a lot of interesting things with it, the world, dungeon, boss, and very core design of the game rarely complements this system by instead choosing to fall back on the same tired classic Zelda formula we've seen since A Link to the Past. That doesn't make it a bad game, just an internally inconsistent one that has a wellspring of untapped potential. Taken as is, it's a middle-of-the-road Zelda game. Very playable, but nothing special. And that's my problem with it, because had the ecosystem been removed entirely and this been yet another sword and shield top-down Zelda that doesn't push boundaries or innovate in the slightest, I actually think it would have been a much better game. But because Nintendo and Grezzo created such an interesting system and then do the absolute bare minimum with it in favor of relying on worse versions of classic Zelda mechanics through the extremely tacked-on sword fighter mode, and in turn treating their new and interesting mechanics as pointless gimmicks, the game is now a lesser work of art, and from where I sit, the most disappointing game of the year. October was actually a really stuffed month for game releases, yet most of what was released were merely ports, remakes, and remasters of previously released games, as well as the usual deluge of hit-or-miss indie horror titles. The Silent Hill 2 remake was probably the standout for many, and while I'll admit it looks pretty damn good, even to an anti-remake fuddy-duddy like myself, it's not something that I felt was really worth my time, since the original Silent Hill 2 is already a perfect video game, and any remake of it is just going to be a lesser experience, regardless of its technical achievements and polish. Essentially, an exercise in stripping away the very things that made the original a masterpiece to begin with. Fine for some, but not for me. However, horror games in general had a very strong presence in all of 2024, not just in the month of October, with a new one seemingly popping up at least once a week, stretching all the way back to January. Of course, most of them were of the first-person, jump-scare-laden variety, or merely eerie walking simulators. Nothing against this kind of game, as I actually played and enjoyed several this year, such as Wreck Paroxysm, Supernormal, The Pony Factory, Still Wakes the Deep, Zoocosis, and probably half a dozen others that I've already forgotten about, but if you've played one of these kind of games, you've sort of played them all, which might be why Platform 8 in particular was my favorite of the first-person horror games I played last year, because it breaks so many conventions and gets so creative with the genre. As a salaryman riding the train home from work in a world where strange anomalies are so commonplace that they're almost mundane, Platform 8 tasks you with moving throughout different train cars, interacting with and avoiding the paranormal activity of ghosts, giant hands, glitches in reality, creepy passengers, and much, much more that I really don't want to spoil. Each of these interactions has a single solution and act as mini puzzles and challenges that you'll figure out slowly over the course of many different runs. This is one of those games that's small in scope but packs a massive punch, and the only thing that's really wrong with it is that I want more. Hopefully developer Kotake Create will keep expanding upon their 8 series and give us more of that one day. Yet what was most surprising about the horror genre this year had to have been just how many new and interesting survival horror games were released, as this is a subgenre that has been largely ignored in this modern era of jumpscare-laden YouTube lore video bait, a type of experience that's typified the vast majority of horror games released in the past decade or so. Hollow Body was a Silent Hill-style survival horror set in a retro-futurist world that I found to be a short and sweet throwback to the golden age of horror video games. Sorry We're Closed was a potent mix of Resident Evil and Killer 7 that revels in its queer aesthetic and focuses on the horrors of love and companionship. Fear the Spotlight was a double whammy of two interconnected games that played with well-worn puzzle mechanics of the survival horror genre, providing unexpected twists on tropes you've seen in dozens of other games. Late Homework asked what if Silent Hill existed in the Animal Crossing universe, while Among Ashes played with the very concept of horror video games themselves as a super meta creep fest of interesting ideas that admittedly are at times a little rough, but nonetheless manage to intrigue. However, the best of these, outside of Crow Country, had to have been Conscript, a top-down survival horror in the vein of 2017's Darkwood, which saw you playing as a French soldier during the Battle of Verdun in World War I, and it's noteworthy as it's among the rare few horror games to remove all of the supernatural elements you'd expect, and instead cranks up its dread and misery to uncomfortable levels as only a realistic historical fiction such as this possibly can. This is one of the most bleak and depressing games I've ever played, but it was also one that I simply couldn't put down, and I chewed through my entire 18-hour playthrough of it in only 3 days simply because of how engaging it all was. Mechanically, there's not a whole lot new going on, but its excellent level design, setting, and the choice of having a top-down 2D perspective all work together to give new life to the tried and true survival horror mainstays of finding items and keys to open paths and lock doors, as well as having to carefully manage an ever-dwindling supply of precious resources. This is another game that was so close to making my top 10, but it fell just a little bit short. Still, it's a fantastic little horror game that any fan of the genre should definitely play, and an exceedingly impressive first game for a solo indie developer such as this. It seems that Daniel Mullins's Inscription has had a profound yet subtle impact on the world of indie games in recent years, as lately we've been getting a lot of games that seek to ape his multi-genre conceptual spaghetti style, for better or for worse. Games that mix genres, perspectives, graphics, themes, and tones are nothing new. In fact, it's sort of been the MO for a lot of first-time indie devs looking to make a name for themselves for a while now, but few developers have the technical chops to actually balance all of these disparate elements to create a cohesive whole. The aforementioned Among Ashes, while being a game that I enjoyed, tended to suffer from this gimmicky pitfall, as each of its gameplay styles was a bit hit or miss and felt as though the developer was trying way too hard at seeming more skilled than they actually are. In contrast, Is This Game Trying to Kill Me, terrible title but awesome game, is a multi-genre, multi-graphic, multi-perspective puzzle adventure slash escape room that balances all of its mechanics and expertly intertwines them with such skill and precision that they make it look easy. Essentially, the game is 2-in-1, an escape room style cabin in a 3D first-person perspective, as well as a 2D top-down adventure on the computer in the center of this cabin. The ingenious part, however, is how the two games interact with and affect one another. There are panels you move in the cabin that create a bridge in the computer, eyeballs in the 2D game whose perspective can only be perceived in the cabin, hints and clues scattered about both that apply to the other, and so much more. This is another one that's short and sweet, lasting only a few hours or so, but it's a few hours of ingeniously delightful gameplay that aims to impress with how clever it is, and very much succeeds. 2019's Smile for Me from Limbo Lane was a surprising treat that I randomly stumbled upon a couple of years ago, and I'm so glad I did, because had I not, its successor, Great God Grove, probably would have slipped right past me. And that would have been a real shame, because this glorious little adventure game that sees you vacuuming up and launching objects and phrases to try and solve conflicts between the game's massive assortment of lovable and quirky characters is something I never realized was missing from my life. Combining an excellent art style and presentation with a catchy soundtrack, heartwarming story, and some of the most mesmerizing and joyous animation and character designs my eyeballs have ever had the pleasure of drinking in, Great God Grove is everything that Smile for Me was, but cranked up well past 11. This is a game that's just unabashed fun and warm, fuzzy feelings from start to finish, with just a hint of creepiness and unease at its core, and one that I'm very much looking forward to playing again in a few years once I've forgotten the solutions to most of its puzzles. It takes the number 8 spot in my list of the best games of the year. Stalker 2, like Dragon's Dogma 2, was another game that I picked up on release day, only to find that it was impossible to play due to some very poor optimization, frequent hiccups, crashes, and abysmally low frame rates. Despite both of my computers being well within spec, it simply didn't happen, and no amount of tinkering made it happen. Like, I could get it to run, but the game would constantly fluctuate between 40 plus FPS to only like around 5 to 10, and there was never any indication when or why it would happen, so yeah, no thanks. This, like with Dragon's Dogma 2, seems to have been the experience of a lot of players, even those with computers far more powerful than my own, which is just ridiculous. This practice of releasing a game that's only ever been tested on best case scenario machines and then using the telemetry mined from your customers to find all of the memory leaks and unexpected behavior is something that's getting really old. If you genuinely think that that's the best way to stress test your game, put it out in early access for a while. That's what the program's for. Don't just ship it and shrug when only a handful of people are actually able to play it as intended, let alone get the game to run in the first place, but I digress. So I, like a lot of others, returned the game and moved on. However, unlike with Dragon's Dogma 2, I do plan on giving this game another shot sometime next year after it's been updated and patched some more, and as a way to test out the newer, beefier rig I plan on building sometime this winter, as it looks like a game I'd really enjoy once I'm able to actually play it. Here's hoping that's the case. Last year's Pizza Tower proved that there's still very much a market for the Wario Land-style batshit hyperactive platformer, as it was not only an instant hit, but vastly exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own, as it ended up as one of my favorite games of the entire year. So it made sense that Anton Blast would receive a bit of skepticism upon its announcement as a game that was merely trying to capitalize on Pizza Tower's success, but thankfully that skepticism has seemingly disappeared now that the game is finally out, as Anton Blast is yet another fantastic Wario-like that I very much enjoyed. While the game never quite hits the same heights that Pizza Tower did, Anton Blast is still, well, a blast, a game that sticks far closer to the Wario Land 4 formula that both games are paying homage to, but still one with enough new ideas and creative drive that it can stand on its own. Excellent animations and music, hilarious dialogue and character interactions, and a heart-pumping, balls-to-the-walls difficult gameplay that manages to kick your ass while almost always stopping just short of frustration, except that pinball level. I fucking hate that pinball level. Anton Blast is a joy from start to finish, and one that I'll most likely return to at some point due to its short and sweet nature that ends long before the game overstays its welcome. I've never personally understood the appeal of the clicker/incremental/idle genre, as each and every game I've played in the past always just seemed to be a waste of time, a way to watch numbers go up without actually doing anything. Combine this with the fact that most clickers are full of ads and or microtransactions in which you can pay real money to continue to not play the game, but even faster, and I just assumed that this was something that would never be for me. That is, until I stumbled upon Elysium, an underrated incremental clicker that's dropped the mic on the entire genre and proved to me personally that all it takes to make a good one of these is to actually put some heart into it and care about making a good game over suckering people out of their hard-earned cash and precious time. The goal of Elysium is to dig for relics in various locations to add to your ever-growing museum, the visitors of which generate income that you can use to increase your stats, advertise to bring in even more customers, and travel to new locations to find ever-rarer treasures that will further increase your profits, all of which starts out small and modest, but eventually balloons to insane levels as the very nature of reality starts to warp around your ridiculously growing museum empire. But the thing I like most about Elysium is how hands-on it all is. Sure, you can just sit back and let the game play itself, but you won't actually get very far. This is a clicker where you actually have to, play the game, and furthermore is one that has the decency to end just as it's about to get stale. I really hope developer Rat Monthly keeps making games in any genre, because Elysium is an exceptional first game that's already being labeled by incremental clicker aficionados as the best of the best. Check it out if you're a fan of clickers, or better yet, if you're not a fan of clickers, as you might find, like I did, that this sort of thing is for you after all. All it took was a developer who followed his heart and trusted his muse and avoided getting greedy like other clicker devs to make me see that. Alright, so this video is much longer than I expected, but there are still a few games that I really want to talk about, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna end things on a bang with a rapid fire round. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1. Europa was a decent enough if underwhelming journey clone about a robot boy who must travel to a floating island where his human ancestors are awaiting him in stasis, and while its gorgeous visuals and music are a sight to behold, it just doesn't have the same spark and flow that's necessary to prevent a walking simulator such as this from growing stale, and overall I found myself having to force myself to see it through to the end despite it only being a few hours long. Angerfoot and Mad Mullet Jack are two gloriously stylized, fast-paced, level-based FPSs with some first-person platforming thrown in for good measure that are all about the quick and stylish murder of everything that stands between you and your goals. Both are easy to get into, but difficult to master rides that will get your heart racing with their sheer machismo-laden, adrenaline-fueled gameplay that's hard to put down once you've gotten a taste for it. Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom combines Spyro the Dragon and Crazy Taxi into a unique 3D platforming experience where you're unable to directly jump, but can use the nuanced and simple but difficult to master controls to finagle your way around through clever combinations of dashing, braking, and canceling maneuvers at just the right moment to launch yourself where you need to go. A game that knows what it wants to be and doesn't compromise on its vision to try and lure in a wider audience like so many other 3D platformers released this year. Kitsune Tales was a decent little 2D platformer in the vein of Super Mario Bros. 3 that didn't really bring anything new to the table outside of its wonderfully ingenious power-up system, but still manages to be a good time for retro gaming enthusiasts nonetheless, while its heartwarming story about a lesbian love triangle is surprisingly well written and kept me coming back for more. Blood is a gloriously animated top-down action adventure that has the style and tone of a Powerhouse-era Cartoon Network show that actually would have been a lot better if it were a minimal interaction game like Harold Halibut, and thank goodness you're here, as its gameplay is painfully mediocre, while the loose hit detection and the obscene amount of poorly balanced arena battles certainly aren't doing it any favors. Likewise, The Plucky Squire wows with its beautiful storybook aesthetic that has you swapping between the pages of a children's book and the real world, yet unfortunately ends up as another painfully mediocre action adventure that has to interrupt the gameplay every few seconds with some exposition or explanation of the most rudimentary of video game mechanics, and no, the game's new streamline mode doesn't fix this, but it definitely helps. Paper Trail is a whimsical and insidiously difficult puzzle game about folding space-time as though they are pieces of paper, which allows you to traverse through this richly detailed world, all the while delivering a heartwarming story about stepping out of your comfort zone and chasing your dreams regardless of the level of challenge or whether or not you have the support of the people around you. Miniatures is a short and sweet collection of point-and-click vignettes that each tell a bite-sized story brought to life with some exceptionally minimalistic art direction and tone that feels like a combination of the works of Giant Sparrow and Amanita Design. Enigma Fear is a spooky mystery game that takes many of the tropes of a survival horror but uses them to craft a completely different type of experience in this wonderfully stylized world that seamlessly mixes the separate visual styles of 3D objects atop pre-rendered backgrounds with a 32-bit pixel art aesthetic that somehow combines into one cohesive whole. Shipwreck 64 billed itself as a lost N64 game that was rediscovered and found to have been lost for a very good reason, and while it has a few neat ideas and puzzles here and there, it ends up as little more than a bog standard horror game that's practically ruined by the obscene amount of ARG puzzles that require you to go to the game's website and or YouTube to solve or piece together its incredibly shallow lore that believes itself to be something profound when it's anything but. The itch demo that came out years ago was actually a lot better. Caves of Cud is an insanely ambitious classic roguelike whose deep gameplay systems are rivaled only by Dwarf Fortress. A game 17 years in the making, this is one I'm still not sure if it's for me or not, but I'll be damned if I'm not blown away by the sheer commitment to the craft and the audacious muse that asks so much from the game's developers, who really have only just reached a milestone with the game's 1.0 release. What an absolute chad of a game. Amanda the Adventurer 2 expands on the unique horror gameplay of its predecessor by further leaning into the convoluted nature of its puzzles. Caravan Sandwich is an interesting laid-back exploration game in a similar vein to Tchia. Neva is a richly animated platforming adventure about the bond between a young woman and her wolf. Arco, a Western tactical RPG with an engrossing low-bit pixel art aesthetic. Drova, a gloriously realized dark fantasy CRPG that falls somewhere between Gothic and Fallouts 1 and 2 in terms of how it all plays out. Crypt Custodian is a top-down action adventure game that has the flow, pacing, and technical combat of a roguelite, and I should probably stop there, actually. As you can see, 2024 was a phenomenal year for video games, but only if you went out of your way to find something interesting to play. Overall, I would say that 2024 was a much better year for video games than even 2023, but most of the games that made this year special didn't come from the AAA market. They weren't promoted or advertised or even talked about all that much by most gaming influencers. Instead, 2024 was defined mostly by its failures, while the true art remained undiscovered and unloved. Ask yourself, did any of your favorite YouTubers, streamers, or game journalists, if you have any, do anything much this year outside of complain about the state of the industry and the corporatism that often defines it? Or did they interact with, applaud, or even combat the unchampioned, unsung games that in actuality made this one of the strongest years that video games have ever seen? Did they take these games seriously as works of art, or did they just treat them as yet another disposable piece of entertainment? And for that matter, did you? How many games did I mention in this video that you were hearing about for the very first time? Did you even know that 2024 was a great year in gaming? Do you even care? Food for thought as we head further into 2025. I'm Noa Lee, god of game criticism, and thus have I spoken.